It's safe to say that it's now past Notion's time as the latest and greatest tool in the productivity space, which means that now that we're without the clouding of shiny toy syndrome, we can actually examine what use Notion is as a workspace. Part 1. Do less. If you look at Notion's performance with a large quantity of notes as well as its general focus on aesthetic information delivery, you'll realize that it's a very poor note taking and general information repository app. I find that it's much better as a drafting app where you can quickly arrange information in a way that is visually pleasing and intuitive and can communicate what you're going for quickly rather than with any degree of depth or accessibility. I would attribute this to the block of text structure that Notion has. Every paragraph is essentially its own block that can be modified in a variety of different ways and visually arranged intuitively with a simple drag and drop. There are also columns and dividers to intuitively separate out and parse data in different arrangements, and the text blocks can sync with one another, which is very useful if you're putting together a large draft or large database, but not necessarily if you're just taking notes. My preferred usage of Notion is as a management app because of the automation that is present everywhere. Sometimes I think it goes a little bit too far. For example, there's a new Notion AI feature, but besides that, Notion is very efficient in its use of databases and the different kinds of views that can integrate with one another. We'll talk about this in a moment, but they do also integrate with external services, and I find that that is very useful if you're using it as a centralized place to access other tools. It is by no means a one size fits all in one service. Part 2. What made Notion so good? Orthogonality in computer science is a way to describe how much of a language integrates with itself, how much self interaction occurs within a system. And Notion is very, very orthogonal. There are only a few necessary components, but they all interlink in a way that means that you can effectively construct any tool that you need out of it, even if it's not necessarily the most efficient. This orthogonality is only really possible due to Notion's focus on having relational databases. While the default structure is pages nested within other pages, like a slightly more optimal folder structure, the real meat and potatoes of Notion is the fact that you can construct databases that can connect to one another and exchange information. Notion's databases have a number of different properties that are available to them. The first of which we're going to talk about is the select or multi-select, which lets you pick one or more options out of a list of predefined ones that you established for yourself when you created the property. These are easily read and parsed, especially once you've gotten a little bit of practice into them, and doubly so because you are the one defining them. And they're necessarily restrictive, which I find actually frees up a lot of mental thinking when trying to classify an entry within a database. An extension of the select property is the status property, which communicates the state or completeness of a given entry within a database and provides a lot of impact with filtering and sorting. It has a different kind of rendering. Instead of rendering as a sort of box with rounded corners, it renders as a kind of pill shape with a dot. And I find that this makes it easier to parse and also provides a kind of emergent priority. If you can produce a lot of different kinds of statuses sorted by how important it is, then having it easily available makes it much easier to figure out what to do next. Notion databases are not necessarily or inherently related to one another. To do that, you need to add the relation property, which will interconnect the relevant databases of your choice. Databases can even connect to themselves in certain cases, and there are use cases for that. And rollups are just a way to extract information from that connected database to display on the main one. This also has a lot of different applications based on how you want to use it, and we'll talk about this later. You can also add the dates property to a entry. Typically, I use this for a deadline, and it's only really useful with the timeline view because it can produce a visual block that represents this entry. And I find that that actually concretizes a deadline in a way that just looking at a calendar doesn't. That being said, if you use Notion calendar, dates properties can automatically integrate, which can be very useful, but your mileage may vary there. Going back to the whole drafting functionality of Notion, if you are working within a database and you want a kind of repeating template, that is an option for that. If you click on the drop down arrow next to the new button, you can find this menu that lets you add in new templates. It just creates a page that you can just fill in with whatever you need. And whenever you create a new page, you can select that template and work from a pre established starting point. Part 3, and the longest part of this video probably, is my Notion configuration. My Notion configuration relies on a number of related databases, which we will cover in order of most necessary to least necessary. To construct a database, you just need to open up a blank page, click on the three dots in the bottom, and then the table entry from that menu that shows up. From there, you can create a new table, which will turn this page into its own database. So the first database we're going to talk about is the projects database, which I use to manage broad scope, long-term goals and complex tasks with more than one immediate step. To get the core functionality of the projects database, we need a start date and an end date, a status, some tags, a prerequisite, and a follow-up. If we want to extend the functionality of the projects database by adding on additional databases, there will necessarily be additional properties like the actions and progress properties, the captures property, and the repository property. But again, these are not strictly necessary yet. To create the start and end date properties, you're going to want to click on either the three dots between the magnifying glass and the new button, or the plus icon next to the name column, and then scroll through to find the right kind of property, in this case, just date. There is a created and edited time dates, but we really don't need those. Just the fully modifiable date is fine. You're going to want to create two instances of those, both using the year, month, day format. This gets us the functionality that we're looking for. The status property in Notion automatically comes with three predefined buckets for the states, those being to do, in progress, and complete. Within the to do bucket, we're going to want to add two states, those being to do and queued. To do is for those projects that we want to do in the future but don't have necessary space for. It's kind of a wish list, and the queue section we can actually fill in with projects that are on the way, those that are immediately necessary once we free up space for it. Open states fall into the in progress bucket and indicate that this is a project that is actively being developed. As a rule of thumb, I would never have more than 5 open projects at a given time. And finally, the closed state falls into the complete bucket and indicates that this is a project that is finished and is either marked for deletion or to be placed into a archive, which is an optional database, which we'll talk about in a moment. For the tags property, I like to think of this as a prefix and a suffix indicated by whether it is parenthesized or within square brackets. For the prefix in this case, you're going to want to have 3, which indicates the relevance of the project. How long after its completion will this project matter to me, or what is the time span over which this project will be relevant for my life? I only divide this into lifelong, month long, and year long categories. I think any further granularity kind of keeps you lost in the weeds. And for the suffix, it is the motivation behind the project. Who am I doing this for? Now, there are 3 kinds of motivation that I'm aware of, those being extrinsic, which means that it comes with some kind of external reward, identified, which means that it is a consciously chosen or an ego driven project, and then there is intrinsic, which means it is being done for the joy of the project itself or simply because it aligns with your own values or goals. The prerequisite and follow-up property is the first example of a relation that goes 2 ways into the same database. You can pick a relation and have it relate to the project's database, and then you can click that simple separate directions toggle and rename that property however you will. The prerequisites and follow-up is most useful for me because I am a student and there are multiple projects that can only be done once a previous one is finished, but I don't find it necessary, or I find it demotivating to have it all be an extremely long project. Being able to break it up into manageable chunks allows me to free up space for other open projects and clears up my thinking. The next necessary database is the Actions database, which I use to manage small scope immediate tasks that will make the most progress to our goals on a given day. Actions have a similar property spread as the projects since they are kind of just small scale projects. There are the status property, the context property, the tags property, and the project property. The status property on an action database is the exact same as the status property on a projects database, so you can just copy that over. But when you're in the middle of modifying that database, you can pick a layout. I find that for actions, the layout best suited for them is the board layout, which is similar to a Kanban thing. You can select it to group by status and then hide statuses that you don't want to see, like the to do status and the close status. Those aren't actionable, so we don't want them. Within the board, we only want visible the queued tasks and the open tasks. The open tasks being, the five things we're focusing on for the day, and the queue being whatever fills in once those are completed. The context property comes from the book Getting Things Done and tells us in what external situation can we even access a given action. This is a select property with the options given below. I like to group it into chores, which are done at home, errands, which are done while I'm out, a desktop task, and a laptop task. You can add additional context like your phone, out with friends, all that kind of stuff. It's really up to you, and there's most flexibility within the context property. The tags property for actions is very similar to the tags property for projects in the sense that there is a prefix and a suffix, though for actions, the prefix is a question of focus, whether I need to remove distraction or whether I can just put this on in the background and work on it at my own pace, and the suffix being the amount of time that I am either willing or I am projected to spend on the project. This can be a necessary factor, but not as much as you may think. You could easily replace this with an energy demand or an attention demand. The point is that the tags property indicates the internal state necessary to work on a given action, and the context property indicates the external state necessary to work on a given action. Finally, there is the projects property for actions. Now, not every action necessarily has a parent project, but I find that for me, most of them do. So to add this, I actually go back into the projects and I add a relation that links to the action database that goes both ways. It shows on actions, and then you can add a roll up to projects, which will count the number of statuses that belong into the complete group, and you can display that as a ring or as a bar, which is an easy way to display progress. The captures database exists to mitigate distraction and encourage a kind of relaxation by providing an outlet for stray thoughts and ideas. To view the relevant captures for a given project, you need to first relate the capture database to the project database. You create a relation and then you check off the toggle that says to show on properties. And from there, that's all the real configuration that needs to happen for the captures database. Here, you would just use it by writing in any notes, any stray ideas that enter your mind, any particular drafts for a given work, and from the necessary project that it's linked to, you can find those captures, sort through them, read them. That's the main benefit of this particular database. The archive database is not really a database. I would just leave it as a blank page where you would process finished projects for deletion or storage into an integrated or external repository. Now, the reason why I wouldn't structure it as a database is because when you drag one project or one data entry to another database in Notion, Notion will import all of the necessary properties, not as rollups or a relation, but as just raw properties into the database. And we want to keep the archive as uncluttered and as simple as possible. Once a project is finished, it's safe to say that none of its properties are really ever relevant anymore. So I would just leave the archive blank as a place to drag and drop finished projects. The repositories database is an internal repository used to contain finished projects for as long as you think they will be relevant. There is value to having an external repository, and I'll talk about that probably in the next video. But Notion is pretty good at managing its own internal repositories as long as you're okay with some slow performance. For repositories, you only really need two properties, that being description and projects. The projects is a list of references. It is not that the repository database contains projects, it's that the repository database references projects. The description property is pretty self-explanatory, but you would add it like you would a text property, and I would just use this to indicate that, hey, this is a repository that is necessary. It's a particular category, and you explain what that category is supposed to hold. Any given repository can hold any number of projects, which is why we're adding the projects as a relation. You can have this shown on the project, so it's not strictly necessary. Again, you want no limit here, so you can just have an infinitely long list of finished projects that are relevant to a given repository. With the Workspaces core databases all wrapped up and finished, we can now take a look at what it looks like in action. The data flow for the workspace begins with a project which is broken down into a number of actions. Once those actions are finished, you can move the project into the archive where it can then be processed for deletion or to be referenced within a repository. As you work on a project, you'll probably find that you accumulate a number of captures, either from external influence, external inspiration, or from referencing other projects within the repository. And from these captures, you can then process them into additional actions or as notes to modify existing actions. I have a template within the project database which asks two general questions. One, what the accept state of the project is. I find that this is a bare minimum kind of protection to keep me from overworking, keeps me from perfectionism when working on any given project. And then the second question is a general post mortem. If you're unfamiliar, a post mortem is a practice where you, before you embark on a project, you ask yourself what would cause you to fail or what is most likely to cause you to fail, and then you create a list of ways to address those potential pitfalls and problems. To create actions from a project, it's important to focus on the next tangible step. What this looks like for any individual person varies. There's not a one size fits all process, but I think it's fair to say that it's universal to consider whether you want clarity of information or digestibility of information. The more actions a project has, the more clear cut it becomes, but it becomes harder and harder to parse mentally. It can make a project seem much, much larger than it actually is. Finding the balance is also individual, and I encourage you to mess around with whatever you find to be intuitive. The archival process only asks three main questions. The first one is, do I need to keep this project around? What can I take from it? And what can I discard? From here, you can fill in the body of the project page with the main takeaways, what's worth keeping around, and then link it to the necessary repository. And then you can just leave it there. There's not much more to it. That is all the time we have today to cover this week's topic. And so I hope it has been useful to you, and I will see you in the next release of Building Better.